Hello, and thank you for joining us for this special discussion with NASA Worm creator Richard Danne. I'm Bettina Inclan with NASA's Office of Communications. What an exciting day to celebrate NASA's identity and the amazing work of designer Richard Danne, the creator of the NASA Worm. As we all know, we recently took the worm out of retirement. NASA Logotop is back into NASA's visual vocabulary. In his long, illustrious career, Richard worked with clients globally like DuPont, AT&T, and the list goes on and on and on. He's won national and international awards, including 3 U.S. presidential awards for design excellence. And one of those was for the creation of the worm and the graphics standards manual. Together with Bruce Blackburn, Richard designed the worm at a time similar to ours. In the late 1970s, when the worm was first introduced, NASA was gearing up to unveil the space shuttle, which would transport humans from U.S. soil into space. It was the first reusable space vehicle. And similar to today, we're once again launching humans into space and now to the International Space Station. And this time, we're doing it from American soil. Reintroducing the worm in such an emblematic way, it really symbolizes the importance that we're once again introducing a new era of human spaceflight. While the worm was retired in 1992, we brought it back. It never really went away. It is now more popular than ever. We're looking forward to talking to Richard about what it means and what his thoughts of the worm, what it means to NASA in this important time. So before we start a conversation with Richard, we're going to have a conversation with Bert, our branding liaison, our head of branding here at NASA headquarters, and David Rager, who is in charge of the design lab at JPL. They'll have a short slide presentation on how the worm will be used by the agency as part of the NASA Worm Working Group. They've updated NASA graphics standard with the help of Richard and an incredible team. We look forward to hearing more from them. Now on to Bert and David.
Thank you, Bettina. This is really indeed an exciting day today, and I'm very excited to have David Rager with me, who's in charge of the design lab at JPL, to go through a short presentation on the use of the worm. And we are going to discuss the way it's being used today, and then how it's going to be embraced in the graphics standards manual. So we'll let David bring up the slides, and then I'll begin, and then he'll take over. So NASA and the worm. So earlier in the year, Bettina Inclan formed a worm working group, a very exciting one. It worked very well together. It included Richard Danne, of course, the original designer of the logo, Yvette Smith, who is in charge of approvals of merchandise and works on branding issues for the agency, David Rager, who's the creative director of the JPL Design Lab, Dan Goods, who manages the studio at JPL, and Toon Hla at NASA headquarters, who's the lead designer for the agency, as well as Veronica Talbert, who is a designer with NASA headquarters. So the background, so the worm was officially retired in 1992, and we've been considering the next steps beyond DM2 and the use of the NASA worm in merchandise in the general official integration into NASA's visual vocabulary. So we're currently amending the Code of Federal Regulations to take the worm out of retirement, which is very exciting. And we created this Tiger team, which I mentioned already. So just in general, just for the goals of the logo type integration and our approach, is the logos are meant to be used together when you use the worm. And the insignia will still always remain the primary logo for the agency, and the logo type, the worm, will always be used to support. We're going to use it only in specific cases, meaning the worm, in ways that can really take advantage of visibility, brand awareness, and the wow factor. It will be used on specific assets, and will have selective use in bold applications. And we'll take advantage of the enormous popularity of the worm today. And I'll let David take over from here.
Sure. Thanks, Bettina. Thanks, Bert, for both of you guys for inviting me to participate. And of course, thanks to JPL 18X leadership for supporting the design lab in this effort. And of course, none of this would be possible without Richard's work and his guidance, and for his work making such a celebrated mark in the first place. You know, I'll try to be quick going through this presentation, but before I do, I wanted to note that, you know, while this was largely a brand identity exercise, it's important to remember that brands are so much more than the images that are used to represent them. And what makes the NASA brand so strong is what it represents. The work that we do is for everyone. And when we succeed, the entire planet celebrates together. And while my vintage meatball sweatshirt is cool looking, it's also a celebration of something that's really increasingly rare, which is togetherness. And it's really been an honor to participate in that in this effort, even in a small way. And we began our pursuit by evaluating the two marks and looking at how they could work together. And we quickly found that really they do a great job of balancing each other out in terms of what they bring to the table. The legibility of one is made up for the visibility of the other. The meatball always has this great officialness to it, and while it may be made up of many parts, we have the worm that is fairly simple and bold. And I think that officialness of the insignia really allowed us to look at be a little bit more relaxed and free in our approach to how we integrated supporting elements like the worm. Really our approach was logical, simple, and above all, it was thoughtful. We really care about how we reintroduce this. And of course, all of that effort is supported by a limited use case and some bold applications. There's some value in scarcity here. And going through our applications, this is where sort of the rubber meets the road. Starting with aircraft, the classic T-38, was where we began looking at ways to implement things properly. And as I mentioned, we keep this meatball that lives near the heart and the brains of the craft. And we have the logo type as a supporting element, which is highly legible from a distance. Similarly, we built off the DM2 spacesuit markings. And while these aren't large applications, they're highly visible, when we see the work that is being done. And large meatball on the shoulder and small worm front and center supporting it. Moving through quickly to spacecraft. Some of us have seen these renderings already, but on the SLS we have large worms that are highly visible as it's traveling through the sky, but we keep the meatball up top near the payload and the crew. And then on Orion, these are some renderings that we worked on with the team, keeping the meatball up near the top and using the worm along the cowling on the side, and a more accurate representation of how it may look most of the time is shaded by the panels. And you can see, even when you just see a sliver of that logo, you already know what it is. It's so baked into our consciousness and our imaginations and our history with it. Looking at buildings, these are again things that are aspirational, not reality yet. But one of the things that the worm also can bring to the table is some surprise and delight. We have these kind of Easter egg opportunities of doing things like painting it giant on the top of a building where no one can see it from the ground. But when you get up in the air, it's a nice reminder. It makes you smile. And this is not Photoshop. This is real. This is at JPL at our space flight operations building, and the paint is still drying on this, and it's a nice second read as you approach the SFO center, the new lobby that we're building out. And then, of course, looking at vehicles, always fun applications to do. This is where the worm really becomes the Python and a super graphic. You can see even in an application where it's 40% obscured, you know exactly what you're looking at, and you can imagine this sort of driving by in the distance at a launch event. And then similarly, but smaller applications on the side of an equipment shuttle, you might have a giant worm on the side with the insignia still remaining on the front, acting as the seal, as a stamp. And of course, everyone loves merch, and this is where we, in the rules, sort of are allowed to break away a little bit and not use the two together. And really, what we wanted to do is use it as an opportunity to create some just some guidelines or some examples of how the worm could be used as a super graphic. And it's always fun to to play around with these examples of best-in-class merchandise. I think it'd really sing. And of course, we've updated our graphic standards manual, and this is available to everybody now. And it'll have a little bit more detail on how the applications are used. And none of the large applications are, immediate action. They're sort of being slowly rolled out. And we're taking a new approach to the standards manual, which is it's a living document, and it's going to be slowly upgraded and integrated with the new digital and broadcast graphics that are coming soon. So that's a quick look at our approach, and I'll hand it over now to the main event. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Bert and David. Appreciate the presentation and going through all the different applications and how NASA will now use the worm as we move forward. So a lot of great information. So Richard, excited about our conversation. You were part of the team that brought back the worm. I'd love to know your thoughts being part of the original team that created the worm and now being part of the team that brought it back into the agency's visual vocabulary.
Well, I'd say it's one of sheer joy, Bettina. It's just thrilling. That's about the best word for it. It's hard to explain how gratifying it is because you must realize that the logotype, the worm, has been put aside for some 28 years. I like to think it was in purgatory or something, but now what's the good news is that it was brought back through Administrator Bridenstine's and SpaceX's announcement on April 2nd of this year, this spring, which happened to be my 86th birthday. So you can't do better than that, right? You cannot.
Yeah, well, what a great birthday present.
Yeah, it's as good as it gets. Anyway, so it is back, and I'm frankly filled with pride, and I know I speak for my colleagues, ex-partner Bruce Blackburn and the entire Danne and Blackburn staff who worked so hard on this over a 10-year period. I was privileged to serve as the external design director for NASA from 1974 to 84. One of the best involvements any designer could ever hope for. And, it was just a glorious association. And I think the return of it is, I do a lot of lectures and podcasts and things. And it's interesting that I never fail to be asked, when are they bringing back the worm? And my response to that has been never. And base that more on the fact that it's so expensive to do something like that. If you did it on a whim, perhaps it was taken away. You can argue that point till the cows come home. It doesn't matter. The point is it was rescinded for a long period of time. But the idea that it's back and serving a good purpose again, I think the committee has done a great job. We'll get into that later. But, we found a way to accommodate both and to honor both. And I think it represents a more vital program for the agency going forward. And what I think is a pretty exciting phase of your lives at NASA.
Yeah.
Bettina?
Thank you so much. There's just so much stuff there that I would love to ask you about. First of all, again, what a great birthday present.
Yeah.
I've been at NASA for a little bit now, and I remember from the beginning, the administrator, Jim Bridenstine, was really interested in bringing back the worm. And when we had this opportunity to launch American astronauts from American soil, from American rockets, and we really wanted to make it a true American moment, we all saw the opportunity to bring back the worm in that very iconic, incredible moment. So it's really exciting that not only could we do that, but that for you to be part of this experience and to help us reintroduce the worm into the NASA vocabulary. One of the things that I did want to pull on is taking a step back. When you first had the opportunity to design the NASA worm, to create a new style for NASA, NASA was a very different place. I've heard in other podcasts, you kind of told the story. For this audience, I'd love for you to take us a step back. What was it like that at that moment? What can we learn today from that experience?
Well, it's so appropriate that you mentioned what a different world it was. And I think that's true of American culture and everything that surrounded it, specifically at NASA. And you realize that NASA, the organization, wasn't all that old in '74. That the program had been involved in so many fascinating different adjuncts, not just manned spaceflight, but the reality is that manned spaceflight has always captured the imagination of the public more than anything else. Well, anyway, the situation back then was that headquarters had their hands full with, 10, 11 different centers who all had their own focus. The centers were very, very competitive. They were not really totally in sync, maybe not totally fused into one organization yet, and a lot of resistance to headquarters. Had nothing to do with design. It's just as a fact. And I even get that because they do so much good work at each of these centers. No wonder they're competitive. They're competitive for funding. They're competitive for the public's attention. And, so that makes it kind of a loose coalition, which was, to be honest with you, a little unruly at that time. I have likened it to a bunch of children not behaving too well. So people were surprised about that, but, it was NACA not too long before that. And they just hasn't fused today. I think that probably some of those same qualities exist today because it's just the nature of the animal. That they're talented and they're competitive, and in a lot of respects, that's a very good thing. So we enter into a picture like that, into a situation, and it wasn't that easy, because we were charged to try to bring this disparate material from all different kinds of things being done at different centers and bring them together and make it one agency, and a vibrant agency at that. So it was a very exciting time. It was a tremendous privilege, actually, to be invited in, which is an unusual story in and of itself. But, it just was, it was fairly chaotic still at that time. And I think today it's much more together, and there's a public perception, there's one agency,
I would say you're right. It's very different today. The agency works really well together. We're one united NASA. And I think a lot of that had started with having one definition with the worm. It helped it, right? Like bringing everyone to start working together, seeing themselves as one united agency helped. And we're a much better agency today, much stronger, doing incredible things all over the world. And I want to give you and your partner credit to help moving in that direction, because you helped with the one NASA approach that we see today as headquarters and all the different agencies and all the different groups that we work together. But I did want to ask a question. Tell us a bit more about Danne and Blackburn and maybe your clientele. Like, why were you invited to redesign NASA and the logo?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's particularly interesting because we'd only been a firm for about 7 months when we received the RFP. So from NASA, it was in summer of '74. We were very young. We were also only about 5 people, which is extremely small for that time, and as it would be today. But anyway, background-wise, I'd had my own firm for about a dozen years, in Dallas first for 4, and then in New York. Bruce was in New York with a very famous firm called Chemarfi Geismar, who actually did a lot of interesting federal work too. So they were on the forefront of it just as we were. But us, I'd worked for General Dynamics and I think Westinghouse and U.S. Information Agency and people like that. And Bruce had worked for Mobil Oil and Museum of Modern Art and a lot of prestigious clients. But we formed, as I said, in the fall of '73, we get this RFP. We were kind of floored by it, I think one of the big reasons that we got the call was Bruce had designed the bicentennial symbol, the U.S. bicentennial symbol. shortly before that. And that was a massive competition, which he won, and it was a huge victory for him personally. So that we decided to form our own firm. The National Endowment of the Arts had created this graphics improvement program a couple of years before. And they were very enamored of the bicentennial symbol. So I think, in my mind anyway, that was a major reason that we got invited. It's one thing to get invited, it's another thing to win it, especially if such a small firm. But we did, and it was a landmark case. NEA wanted a quick victory for these federal programs, and they thought if they get NASA, on board and we get a win, then all the other federal agencies would come along, and that's exactly what happened. So it worked for them. And it worked for us. There's a lot riding on it, so we were under a lot of pressure. It worked great.
Yeah. And what kind of reception did the worm get when it was first introduced? I'd imagine I see it today, when we try to promote some new ideas, there's some people take some time getting used to it. Did that happen when you all introduced the worm to NASA?
Oh yeah. The reception was decidedly hot and cold. It was a fascinating period. Really, the first year was really loaded. Some of it was our fault because the introduction wasn't handled right. Here again, I think it was naivete to some respect on the agency's part and even our own. But the agency felt they'd sit on executive stationery to all the senator directors. With just the logo on it. And frankly, it wasn't the program. Our program touched on everything, aircraft and buildings and signing and, publications, and it was tutorials with it. And it was a very teaching document. And here these letterheads go out with just the logo on it. And it's the first that the center directors had heard that there was a redesign underway. Now, hindsight says that's just not good. Well, they proceeded to detonate all across the land, and Bruce and I had to we toured all the centers and gave the presentation, which was fairly lengthy. There's the presentation with 25 justifications of the logo. It was a real program, not just a badge you stick on to stuff, And we gave that presentation over and over and over. And frankly, once they saw it, everything settled down. They were I remember giving one to Chris Kraft at Johnson Space Center, which was an extraordinary experience. And he said, "I'm okay with it. Let's go." But it should have been done this way to begin with. So, and I tended to agree. So that was part of the section. Now, on the other hand, I quickly point out that while the older staffers had problems with anything new that you were referring to change, it's often doesn't go down very well. So they had a lot of trouble, and they were very enamored of the meatball. On the other hand, the young staffers were just the opposite, and they took to the worm, the logo, like ducks to water, and they were very, very supportive, and it was very quick. And what's fascinating that I think about, that continued for years and years. And there was sort of schism in the agency, between old and new, young and old. And it finally settled down to some degree, but it has still been there all along. And the fascinating thing to me is that some of those young staffers are flight directors now. They grew up, they did good. And now they're in charge. So it's come full circle. I think that's very fascinating, very illuminating, and I think it's a big part of why there's some enthusiasm now for the return of it. I would quickly add also, Bettina, that in all these years when everybody was online arguing about meatball versus worm and everything, I never uttered one word and never got involved in that silliness and the kind of debris that was result of that. Now we find ourselves in a position where I think we found a really good place to land, where we've accommodated both, and it's going to be very healthy for the future. Maybe that'll settle some of that stuff down. But anyway, it's really not a question of throwing something out. I think it's additive value. Another factor, I think, it was the public acceptance, was a tremendous broadcast coverage. Specifically, people like Walter Cronkite, who was such a big fan. And I remember seeing it on screen with a big logo behind him, like, it's just terrific. And they pushed it, they love it, and it helped. So in that sense, going back to a point made earlier, graphics might seem superficial to some, and they can be viewed that way. I do think a really great program or a strong program can help move the big ideas, then the mission forward. And it really is important stuff. It's not just peripheral. It's not window dressing, And when it's right and when it's solid, well, that's the benefit you get.
Absolutely. That lots of great things in there. The importance of graphics, that icon, that design, and what it means to people. There's so much to unpack with what you talked about the importance of internal communications, that the challenge that, because there was a lack of it maybe when we first introduced it, that there was barriers in people accepting it, the importance of engaging all of those people to make sure that they understood and felt like they had a stake in that design. It's stuff that we can learn today, right? When we introduce big concepts to not only at NASA, but anywhere, what that communications plan to make sure that we have strong internal communications, that our stakeholders are engaged. I think, and I hopefully we'll have some time to get into it, but the style guide that you all created with the worm is in itself iconic. It's so detailed, it's so fantastic. Anyone could really understand what we were trying to communicate, and it was so essential to the success of the worm. And you mentioned a little bit about the broadcast coverage, and I have a lot of parallels to today.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I did want to ask is, what makes the worm so special? I know there's a lot of symbolism, even in the design, the simplicity of it. What was the aesthetic motivation behind it? How does it work graphically, and what does it mean?
Well, I think on the artistic level, it was really about expressing the contemporary, progressive propulsion, flight. It had in its very simple forms. It had aerodynamics and I think innovation. It's an engineered product, as one colleague said recently, and one of the best. I think what and then on a practical level, Bettina, what occurs and where we were so convinced needed to be done to cover all this great disparity of materials coming in, all the mediums that NASA dealt with, from publications to space vehicles to signing and everything else, broadcast. The worm is it's almost indestructible in print or on the web, and you can see it from miles away. It's very, very practical. It works well with other fonts and other imagery. So that was part of our intention, and our focus was to make something that could live for a very long time with this disparate elements, not knowing exactly what was ahead in the future, but that would be able to adapt to all of that, and that turned out to be the case. Well, in this time, even when it was rescinded, it seemed to gain popularity and was published all over the world. It was very, very popular in Asia and Europe, maybe more so than even right here in America. But it won a ton of awards and just continued to be published. It was voted. I remember London Creative Review voted one of the greatest logos of all time. I mean, this sort of stockpiled. It just kept going. And there was also a kind of an underlying element, was how could this be rescinded? I'm not going to get into that. That's not for today. I will also say that because I refused to be part of that argument. But really, I think it proved the worth and also, we only have to look now at the reactions since the return. You see billions of comments about happiness about its return. And I don't even think that's a competitive thing with the meatball so much. It speaks to the modern world, the future exploration. It still does that. And so it can be utilized and be very effective. I think I would also add, I've got a collection of, well, in my podcast and talks, I do a segment on copycat culture. And it's about the jillions of lookalikes, the logos that have been done, heavily influenced by the worm. And what that says to me is that it continues to have a lot of impact. And there's something wrong with almost every one of these things. But every week I get another one from somebody that's showing me that. So it's had a real impact. What seemed a little bit far out at first, maybe too simple. What has occurred is it's landed in a place where timeless design. That's why 45 years later, it's still the merchandise with the NASA logo on it, still as hot as can be. And for me personally, I'd just like to add that the thrilling part for me is that a lot of it's for a very, very young audience. We're talking teenagers and things, and all over the world. I also get pictures of kids from around the world with the big logo on their sweatshirt. So that's very complimentary, and it probably bodes well for the future too. For some reason, they're a little bit touched by it, and enough so to buy that garment, that piece of apparel. And so you can say what you will, but that's been sort of a groundswell, and your merchandising guru will tell you that the requests to use the logo have been like a tsunami. So, I'll stand on that. That's pretty good stuff.
Absolutely. We get so many requests to use the logo every day. Bert and Yvette and our team are constantly going through merchandising requests. So thank you so much. One of the things I wanted to touch on before we go to some of the questions that we got submitted from the NASA workforce is I think most designers, we want to create something that is classic, that will live on, that'll become iconic. What do you think is the key to that? I don't know if you went into the design of the worm with that in mind, but what are tips that you can give to today's designers at NASA or outside of the agency on how to create things graphically that can live across generations?
Yeah, and it's a funny thing because in a way I've lived my professional life based on this idea of timeless design. So that's the way I work. And I think a lot of the people that joined us in the firm felt that way too. So you have kind of two schools of thought. One is that to create something that is super hip, maybe, and very now and very alive. And I think this is most prevalent on the web, because a lot of the designs are literally they're there for 8 seconds and then they're gone, and in fact, that people were paid good money, designers, to create this kind of instant happening result. The other side of it is when you're doing a branding program, I don't know anybody that wants to spend a lot of money and then see it wasted, because it doesn't last a decade. So we've been on the other side of that story. And I think that that's the key to NASA. There's no secret that one can pass on. It's just a way of thinking that says, it's almost anti-trendy, if you know what I mean, Bettina. We leave the trendy to others because there'll always be a demand for that. These little burst, rockets. But in our world, and especially in branding, it's an expensive enterprise. It's not so much the design, the cost of the fees, as it is the implementation. And for somebody like NASA, it is. And so when these audience participants ask, when are they going to bring it back? I always say that, to reapply graphics to aircraft or anything else is very expensive. So that's why you don't do it casually, and you don't do it, in a flippant way. And I think that the NASA thing has proven its worth over time, and I think it's just a very good example of how to make it work, how to be practical, and be kind of aesthetically challenging at the same time. Some people say it's as good today as the day it was published. Some people say it's better. So I love to hear that, of course, but it is in fact just a way of the way you solve things and the way you look at life.
What is the one piece of advice that you would give communicators, designers today?
Well, I think my message is pretty simple, and it's be original, be honest, be straightforward, and deliver. It's there's a lot of deception out there. There's so much deflection, and I think that the people who have punched through that are doing it from a base of honesty, and it takes talent. It does, but apply it correctly. A lot of my career was dedicated to issues like nonprofit institutions and even these big agencies, 4 big agencies, they're all nonprofit. Environmental things, music, art, so we're known for the corporate stuff, but there are all these other commitments. And I would ask the communicators to be strong and professional, and then give a good deal of their time to these other causes. We can't afford to do the things anymore that we used to do. They just happen almost naturally. So contribute time to the things that you feel strongly about and love, and maybe it'll work out.
And maybe that's your secret to a long and successful life.
Well, as I said on another podcast recently, I'm a happy man, and I did a bout with, I might have told you, I don't know, with lymphoma that lasted over 2 years. I'm still dealing with it, but I'm extremely positive and happy. So they pay a lot of money to do stuff, but it's still got to come from a base of honesty, integrity, and that's the liftoff. That's the launch pad. And, then you can do great things. You can reach the stars, if you know what I mean.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions from the NASA community that were really interested, excited, inspired by you and your work. So we'll go through some of them. We have Dan Walt from headquarters wanted to know, what would you say to those who are still stuck on the meatball as the NASA logo?
What do you mean? They're still very enamored of it, and Oh, I think I would say congratulations. It's still there. In other words, we didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it's still the primary mark for the agency. I'm hoping that we won't have, 2 sides, as we've seen, and the country is very divisive. Well, we don't want to have that at NASA. So I think it's. I think it's kind of a great solution, because it's still the official mark. We even kept the NASA seal and logo, but most people don't know that. It was in our original manual. But we were using it for more formal things, not so much just mission related. But I would say yes, and I think we've effected a very sensible and practical solution of how to use the best virtues of each of the marks and to benefit NASA. And clearly there are better situations for one than the other. And so now they will coexist. I think it's healthy. And there shouldn't be any real arguments about that. When we're trying to do very bold things, we're going to use the logotype. When it's going to be seen from a great distance, we'll use that, because it's powerful. But it's not like we've obliterated the program. It's fact, if anything, it's just been strengthened, I think.
Yeah. James Martin from Math asks, are there any noteworthy versions of the worm which never made it out to the public?
Well, there's a lot of stuff ends up on the cutting floor when you're working on something as important as this. What happened in our case, we started with things that were more allegorical, not like the meatball, but with some gestures in it like that. More we looked at what we had to pull together, there was so much debris that we made us think simpler and simpler. And even when we got down to a logotype, which we didn't start out working on a logo, rather on a symbol. I think they were more elaborate, more expressive, more allegorical too. But what we found in working on it was that we simplified, made it more streamlined, more flowing, made it, went with the one stroke width and, just for movement, things that were more elaborate, whatever, that's the stuff that fell on the cutting room floor that I'm referring to. So I don't think there was a great alternative, and certainly not when viewed in the long term. And that's why I think we rang the bell with it, and that has sort of been proven out in all these decades.
Yeah. I think I read that your team actually just presented one design, the worm, at the end, right? That's pretty bold. It's pretty bold.
Yeah, because even then people didn't do that. And today I know for a fact, because a lot of colleagues in the business, they're stunned by that.
Yeah.
And staffers are stunned by it. And it was kind of a revolutionary idea, especially since it was such a departure from what they had. The maple was very elaborate and illustrative. It made it harder to live with all these other elements. So we had one solution. So what we had to do was make a very strong point that it was a program. And by doing that, we did about 25 very costly demonstrations of how it worked in any medium, anything from publications to signing to television to aircraft and the like. There were 25 demonstrations which weren't in the contract. There was no money for that sort of thing. We just underwrote it. It was too important to us. It was too important to NEA. And at first when they saw the logo in the presentation of Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Lowe, it was pretty quiet in the room. And then, but as we added these demonstrations to it, it really warmed up and everybody started understanding. By the time we got to the end of the 25 demos, it was pretty much a done deal, even though we didn't get the yes that day. It was about a few days later, And so I think that justified our approach. We wouldn't have had a chance, honestly, if we'd just gone in with a logo. And I think even today, a lot of people don't understand. They think it's a logo, a mark, but it really was a program. It was very expansive. And we did a lot of teaching in that manual, and it's because they didn't have a designer at any center at that time. They had a retouch artist, and they had just about everything else. But now that all changed. We recommended they get an internal designer, graphics coordinator, which they did, and hired Bob Shulman, who became a friend for life. And it was a great relationship. And then the centers then eventually, grew up and took care of business. So it was a wonderful experience to see that happen.
So we have a question from B. Freeman from Goddard. What characteristics do successful modern logos have? And are there any tweaks you'd make to either the meatball or the worm?
Well, I think we've covered some of this already in that, the modern logo. If it's for an event, like a one-time event or something, it can afford to be very spontaneous and almost frivolous. If it's meant for a design program to last for decades, then it has to get more serious, and it has to have innate qualities which will allow it to live that long. So I think that's true of logos across the board. And then they all have to communicate more so today on television and web than in print. So that's a new set of circumstances. And then I think, and what was the second part of your question? You were.
Would you make any tweaks to either the worm or the meatball?
I would not. I think that they each have solid qualities that are totally entrenched. The meatball has been refined over time, made a little simpler. It's a difficult thing to reproduce, and they've made it better than it was. The logo hasn't changed at all. I'm of the opinion you don't do anything to it. If there came a time when it wasn't functioning right or that wasn't good enough, then you do something else. But it's interesting that they both have very long lives.
I have a question from Chris from Marshall. A little bit out of the box, like, what is your favorite logo of all time?
Oh my God, that's an outstanding question. It's almost impossible to answer. You can appreciate that, right, Bettina?
Right. It's like, which is your favorite child?
Well, it would be taken wrong if I said NASA. I would say probably the CBSI, and to explain that, it was designed, as I recall, something like 1951. By Bill Golden, who was one of our giants in the field, died very young. He did this thing. Now think about that. That's 75 years ago. It's been a part of every fall new program promotion that they've done. It's been done over and over, at least 75 times, these promotions. And each time it's looked fresh and different or better or whatever. It's almost impossible to do that. It doesn't look dated today in any way. And the interesting thing, he was influenced by an Amish hex sign out in Pennsylvania on a little auto trip he took. So you never know. But I think that probably has held up and as fresh as anything that we have around. I like the IBM logo with the streaks through it, stuff like that too. But the CBSI is amazing how versatile it has been and what a tremendous longevity it celebrates. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I have another question, and then we're going to wrap up. And as much as I love talking to you, what is it like to have something so simple in form spring from your mind, something that goes on to become the symbol that adorns humanity's tools for exploring the universe?
Well, I would credit my partner, Bruce Blackburn. I think at that time we were capable of doing something like this. I should add to that quickly. I just did a major branding thing, delivered it last week. So it's not like retirement. But I think it is terribly exciting. I think the NASA involvement, by the way, any mark you can do or a program like that lives this long and has touched so many people in the public and all, it's an honor to have been part of it, and it's impressive. So that's how I kind of live my life, is trying to create things that are good for decades. And I think it's, in this particular case, the reason it was so thrilling is I've identified with aeronautics and with space since I was a little boy on a farm in Oklahoma. It's just been an amazing thing to stare at the stars and then finally realize that you're part of it. You're in the middle, in the thick of it. And, it's out there, and now you're out there. So it's the most rewarding thing in the world. Of all the giant clients I've worked for around the world and everything, this has been singular. And I'm so gratified to be back part of the family.
And we are honored to have you part of the family. There's so many more questions that we'd love to ask. I know that we're just running out of time. I just want to thank you, Richard, so much for being part of the NASA family for so long. I know that I'm honored just to be in your same area of existence. But you've brought so much strength to the NASA brand, so much guidance to our team. Really appreciate it. I know if for those that are watching this and want to know more, I encourage you to listen to NASA's Houston. We have a podcast, the July 24th episode of NASA Worm. They talk more to Richard and talk a little bit more also about his background and additional great insight. Richard, thank you again for everything that you've done for this agency. Thank you to Bert and David and the entire team and Richard as well, who helped reintroduce the worm into the NASA vocabulary. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.